What if everything around you right now, all of the people you've ever met, every single place you've been and every single thing you've ever experienced was just a lie? What if none of it was real? What if all of human history is just a carefully crafted illusion created by an advanced civilization light years ahead of us? Well, this isn't something that you would normally hear from someone who is a professional scientist, but it was actually suggested by Nick Bostrom in 2003. He said that an advanced civilization might make incredibly realistic simulations of their own ancestors, and he believes that we may actually be living inside one right now. So, in today's video, I want to talk about why some people believe we are living in a digital world and whether there are any clues in physics that point towards this being true. Let's begin. First, let me tell you a little bit about Nick Bostrom. He's a professional philosopher who works at Oxford University. His main research is in the philosophy of mind, which is basically what consciousness is and how it works. So when he proposed this idea back in 2003, it was mostly based on philosophical arguments rather than scientific evidence. And this is because there isn't any concrete proof that we live in a simulation. However, since then, there have been some interesting developments in physics that somewhat support this idea. So here's how his argument goes. Imagine a civilization thousands of years more advanced than ours. It's so advanced that they can simulate entire universes with billions of people living inside them. Now imagine these people are just like us. They have families, friends, and experiences. And for all they know, they are living in the real universe. So now we have to ask the question, how many of these simulations do you think this civilization would create? Well, according to Bostrom, there's 3 possibilities. The first possibility is that these civilizations go extinct before they develop the technology to create simulations. This is very unlikely, though, because if they are so advanced that they can simulate entire universes, then they would also be advanced beyond things like natural disasters and pandemics, which are usually what causes civilizations to collapse. The second possibility is that they do develop the technology but they choose not to use it. This is also unlikely because creating simulations would require vast amounts of computing power, but it would also require vast amounts of data. We have no idea how much data is required to create one of these simulations, but if it takes a lot of data, then it would be pretty easy to come up with a reason why this civilization would not do it. Maybe storing large amounts of data takes up too much space, or maybe they don't want to waste their resources on something that isn't real. But either way, we still end up with the conclusion that it's unlikely that they won't create any simulations. This brings us to the third possibility, which is that they do run simulations. Now, according to Bostrom, if we are in a simulation, then there would be no way for us to tell. It would be completely indistinguishable from the real world. But if this is the case, then there should be other simulations out there, and each one would contain billions of people just like us. And if we were to find another civilization, then we would be no more special than the people inside a simulation. We would just be the highest level of a simulation. In other words, we would still be living in a simulation. So given those 3 possibilities, we have to conclude that if we are living in a simulation, then there is a near zero chance that we are the only one. There are probably infinite simulations running, each with their own versions of reality. So if we are in a simulation, then we would expect there to be anomalies or glitches in our reality. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. Now, I need to make it clear that this section is going to be mostly speculation, because there is no accepted theory in physics that supports this idea. But there are some interesting coincidences that I want to mention just for fun. One of the most convincing pieces of evidence for us living in a simulation comes from quantum physics. This is because many phenomena in quantum physics resemble how video games work. For example, in quantum physics, we have the observer effect where the very act of observing a particle changes its properties. And then we also have quantum uncertainty, which is the fact that we can't know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect accuracy. These 2 phenomena force us to make a conclusion about how quantum physics works. Either the properties of quantum particles are determined before they are measured, or the act of making a measurement determines those properties. And these ideas are essentially identical to how video games work. In a video game, your character doesn't have any properties until you start playing the game. When you start playing, the game loads and then the properties of your character are determined. So the fact that quantum physics behaves like this could suggest that our universe is programmed. And if that's the case, then the rules of physics could be interpreted as code. With that said, there are other interpretations of quantum mechanics that don't require this kind of programming. Another piece of evidence comes from concepts like black holes, dark matter, and the fact that the speed of light is constant. All of these are interpreted as fundamental constants of nature, but they could also be interpreted as code constraints or glitches in the system. A good example of this is the speed of light. Light travels at approximately 300,000 kilometers per second. That's a pretty big number, and it's also a pretty specific number. Now, you could say that it just happens to be that the speed of light is this one specific value. But what if the speed of light wasn't a fundamental property of nature, but instead a constraint or glitch in the system? This could mean that there is a limit to how fast information can travel in this simulated reality. In other words, it could be a form of censorship. I know this sounds crazy, but there is a famous scientist named Albert Sokal who actually agrees with this. He says that the speed of light could be a result of limitations in the computer that is running the simulation. Okay, another thing worth mentioning is that some scientists have found digital signatures within the standard model of particle physics. Basically, some scientists have discovered mathematical structures in the laws of physics that resemble computer code. For example, the equations of the standard model have a repeating pattern known as a self-similar fractal. And this fractal has a strange geometric structure known as a hyperbolic manifold. Now, some scientists have interpreted this as evidence that the universe is a hologram, but it could also be interpreted as a digital signature or a message left behind by the creators of this simulation. Of course, I must emphasize that this is all speculation. None of these are actual theories in physics. They are just ideas that some scientists have considered. Regardless, there's no denying that there are a lot of weird things happening in our universe, and most physicists would agree that there are a lot of things that we don't understand. So, while it's probably not helpful to think of our universe as a simulation, it's definitely a good idea to keep an open mind. You never know what discoveries scientists might make in the future. I'd also like to mention that there's another branch to this idea, which is that if we are living in a simulation, does that mean that there are other simulations above ours and below ours? In other words, what would it mean for human consciousness if we are living in a simulation? And this is where things get really weird. If we are living in a simulation, then it could mean that everything around us, including our experiences, thoughts, and emotions, aren't real. In other words, it could mean that nothing is real. Of course, this is a really extreme view, and it would completely change the way we understand the world. But it's also an idea that has been explored in movies like The Matrix and Inception. In these movies, the characters live in a simulated reality, but they eventually discover the truth and then they are able to break free from the simulation. In reality, however, it's very unlikely that we would be able to do this because if we are living in a simulation, then the chances are that the creators of the simulation would have made it impossible for us to break free. In other words, it could mean that we don't have free will. As you can see, there are a lot of different ways that this idea of living in a simulation could play out. Personally, I don't think that it's something that we need to worry about. I mean, even if we are living in a simulation, it doesn't really change anything for us. So it's probably best to just enjoy the ride. With that said, do you think we are living in a simulation? Comment your thoughts down below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content.